In the summer of 1858, the River Thames in London grew so thick with human and industrial waste that Parliament itself, sitting in a building directly on its banks, could no longer function. Members of Parliament, some of the most powerful men in the British Empire, tried soaking the curtains in chloride of lime to mask the smell, and when that failed, they discussed moving the entire seat of government upriver to escape it. Newspapers of the time called it the Great Stink, and it was not a metaphor. The river had become an open sewer for a city of over 2 million people, and every scrap of household garbage, every dead animal, every barrel of industrial byproduct that Londoners threw into their streets eventually found its way one way or another into that same slow, stagnant, unbearable water. This was not a temporary crisis. This was simply what it looked like when a city of that size had spent centuries with no real system for taking its own garbage away. Engineers of the era, called in to survey the situation, described the water itself as having thickened into something closer to a moving sludge than a river, opaque and dark, releasing gas bubbles that rose visibly to the surface as decades of accumulated sewage continued to ferment beneath the surface in the summer heat. Boats that still attempted to navigate the Thames reported their hulls emerging coated in a foul residue, and dockworkers along the banks fell ill in numbers significant enough to be recorded in contemporary accounts, even though the precise medical connection between the filth and the illness was still hotly disputed among physicians of the time. This was not a river running through a city anymore. It had become, for all practical purposes, an open, festering wound at the very heart of one of the wealthiest and most powerful capitals on earth. It is easy to picture the sweeping monuments of history, the palaces, the cathedrals, the grand boulevards, and forget the far less glamorous truth sitting directly underneath them, quite literally in many cases. For most of urban history, cities did not have anywhere for their garbage to go, and so garbage simply stayed, piling in streets, filling ditches, rotting in alleyways, becoming layer by layer, year by year, an actual physical part of the ground beneath people's feet. The story of how cities finally solved this problem is one of the strangest, smelliest, and least discussed chapters in the story of human civilization, and it happened far more recently than most people realize. If stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe now because we are about to walk through one of the most overlooked crises in human history, one that quite literally shaped the ground that some of the world's greatest cities are still standing on today. For thousands of years, the basic problem facing any growing city was brutally simple. Human beings produce waste constantly: food scraps, ash, broken pottery, worn-out clothing, and above all else, the enormous volume of human and animal waste generated by dense populations living in close quarters. But almost no city anywhere in the ancient or medieval world developed a reliable, organized system for collecting and removing it. The default solution, for centuries in cities across nearly every continent, was simply to throw it into the street. Household refuse, kitchen scraps, chamber pot contents, the byproducts of any trade practiced at home, from butchery to tanning to dyeing, all of it went out the door and into the nearest public space, because there was, in the most literal sense, nowhere else for it to go. Archaeologists excavating medieval European cities have found something that reveals just how completely this practice reshaped the physical landscape of urban life. Street levels in cities like London, Paris, and York rose measurably over the centuries, sometimes by several feet, as layer after layer of discarded waste, ash, and debris accumulated and was simply built over, paved over, or compacted down by centuries of foot and cart traffic. Entire ground floors of buildings, once at street level, gradually became partially buried basements as the street itself rose around them, an almost unbelievable physical record of just how much unmanaged waste a city could generate and simply absorb into its own foundations over enough time. In some cities, this accumulation happened quickly enough to be noticed and even legislated against within a single generation. Municipal ordinances from medieval towns across Europe repeatedly forbid residents from throwing waste into the street, evidence not that the problem was rare but precisely the opposite, that it was common enough and persistent enough to require repeated official intervention that was, by all available evidence, routinely ignored. Fines for violating these ordinances appear again and again in surviving court records, a clear sign that whatever penalty existed was simply treated by most residents as an acceptable cost of disposing of household waste, the only way that was actually convenient to them, given that no genuine alternative existed. The smell alone, something no photograph or written record can fully convey to a modern audience, would have been an inescapable, constant feature of daily life in nearly any pre-industrial city. Travelers' accounts from across centuries repeatedly describe the overwhelming stench of major cities as one of the very first things a visitor noticed, often from a considerable distance away, well before the city itself came into view. Some cities became so notorious for their smell that visitors wrote about it as though describing a physical landmark, an inescapable, defining feature of the place as recognizable as any cathedral or palace. Except this particular landmark followed you into your lodging, into your food, and into your clothing for the entire duration of your stay. Beyond the sheer unpleasantness, the accumulated filth of pre-industrial cities created conditions that we now understand, with the benefit of modern medicine, to have been genuinely, catastrophically dangerous. Standing water contaminated with waste became an ideal breeding ground for disease. Rats and other vermin, drawn by the abundance of food waste rotting in open streets, thrived in numbers that would horrify a modern city dweller. And these same rats carried fleas responsible for transmitting some of history's deadliest epidemics, including the plague itself, which repeatedly devastated cities across Europe and Asia in outbreaks directly connected to the filthy, waste-choked conditions that dense urban populations had come to accept as simply normal. Cholera outbreaks in the 1800s provided some of the starkest, most well-documented evidence of this connection, though it took a remarkably long time for medical science to actually accept it. For decades, the prevailing medical theory held that disease spread through miasma, foul-smelling air rising from filth and decay, rather than through contaminated water or direct contact with waste itself. This theory was not entirely wrong in its intuition. Filth genuinely was the source of the danger, but it was wrong about the exact mechanism, and this misunderstanding delayed effective public health responses for generations. It was not until a London physician meticulously mapped cholera deaths during an outbreak in 1854, tracing an alarming cluster of cases back to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, that the true waterborne nature of the disease began to be seriously considered by the medical establishment, a breakthrough that came only after tens of thousands of Londoners had already died in repeated cholera epidemics throughout the preceding decades. Even after this discovery, acceptance within the broader medical and political establishment came slowly and grudgingly. Many physicians of standing continued to defend the miasma theory for years afterward, in part because it aligned more comfortably with existing assumptions about disease, and in part because the alternative, that London's own water supply, drawn in some cases from sources perilously close to sewage outflows, was directly poisoning its residents, implicated the very infrastructure and institutions that city officials were reluctant to admit had failed so badly. It would take additional outbreaks, additional deaths, and additional decades of mounting evidence before waterborne germ theory became the unquestioned scientific consensus it is today. A delay that historians of medicine now regard as one of the most consequential missed opportunities in the history of public health. Individual households developed their own patchwork of coping strategies, none of them particularly effective by modern standards. Wealthier homes might employ a servant specifically tasked with carrying waste out of the house, though even then, the destination was often simply a nearby street, alley, or open cesspit rather than any genuine system of removal. Cesspits, essentially large pits dug beneath or near a home to collect human waste, were common across cities for centuries, and they required periodic emptying by workers whose job ranked among the most physically unpleasant and socially stigmatized occupations of the entire era. These workers, sometimes called night soil men, performed their work after dark specifically to avoid the worst of public attention, hauling collected waste through city streets by cart to be dumped, often at the edge of the city or sold to farmers as fertilizer, one of the few genuinely productive uses that pre-industrial society managed to find for the enormous volume of waste it generated. This connection between urban waste and agriculture reveals something genuinely important about how pre-industrial economies actually functioned. Unlike modern trash, which we often think of as simply worthless material to be discarded, a significant portion of pre-industrial urban waste retained real economic value, and an entire informal economy grew up around the collection, sorting, and resale of materials that a modern eye would see only as garbage. Rag and bone collectors walked city streets gathering discarded cloth, which could be sold to papermakers, since paper at the time was made primarily from pulped rags rather than wood. Bones were collected and sold for use in fertilizer, glue, and bone china production. Even cigar ends and cigarette butts in later centuries were collected by dedicated scavengers who extracted and resold the remaining tobacco to the poorest smokers who could not afford whole cigarettes. In London specifically, an entire industry grew up around something that sounds almost unbelievable to modern ears: the collection and resale of household ash and cinders, byproducts of the coal fires that heated nearly every home in the city. These materials, referred to as dust in period slang, were collected by dustmen and sorted at massive dust yards, sprawling sites where an army of workers, often desperately poor women and children, sifted through mountains of ash by hand, separating out anything with resale value, unburned coal fragments, bits of metal, broken pottery, and any cinders coarse enough to be sold to brickmakers, who used them as a key ingredient in London's iconic yellow bricks. Some of these dust yards grew to a genuinely staggering scale, described in period accounts as literal mountains of ash rising over the surrounding neighborhood, monuments built entirely from the accumulated waste of a city that had no other organized way to make it disappear. The workers who sorted this ash by hand, known as sifters, performed among the most degrading and physically hazardous labor available to the urban poor of the era. They worked for hours crouched over heaps of ash and cinders still occasionally hot from recent household fires, breathing in fine, choking dust with every movement, searching by touch and sight for anything of even the smallest resale value amid the debris. Charles Dickens, among other writers of the period, took direct notice of this trade, using the dust yard as a recurring symbol in his fiction for the strange, inverted economy of Victorian London, a city wealthy enough to produce mountains of waste and simultaneously poor enough in its lower ranks that entire families could survive by picking through those same mountains for anything the wealthy had discarded without a second thought. This informal recycling economy, remarkable as it was, could never come close to actually solving the underlying crisis. It merely extracted whatever fragments of value existed within the waste stream, while the overwhelming bulk of it, the genuinely worthless material, the rotting food, the contaminated water, the sheer volume generated by a rapidly industrializing population, continue to accumulate in streets, rivers, and vacant lots faster than any informal system of scavengers could possibly manage. As cities grew explosively during the Industrial Revolution, packing more people into denser urban spaces than ever before in human history, the waste crisis grew in direct, brutal proportion, culminating in exactly the kind of catastrophe that struck London in 1858, when the accumulated filth of an entire metropolis finally became impossible for even the most powerful people in the country to simply ignore. The Great Stink proved to be a genuine turning point, not because the smell itself was unprecedented, London and cities like it had smelled dreadful for centuries, but because it happened to strike directly at the seat of government, forcing the very people with the power to act to personally, physically experience the consequences of centuries of civic neglect. Within weeks of the crisis, Parliament authorized funding for an ambitious new sewer system, engineered specifically to carry waste away from the city entirely rather than allowing it to simply accumulate in the Thames. This system, built over the following decade under the direction of a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, is still, in large part, the foundation of London's sewer infrastructure today, a genuinely remarkable feat of Victorian engineering built directly in response to a crisis that had been allowed to fester, quite literally, for centuries before anyone in power was sufficiently motivated to actually address it. The scale of Bazalgette's project was, for its time, almost unimaginable. Over 1,000 miles of new sewer pipe were laid beneath the streets of London, intercepting waste that had previously flowed directly into the Thames and redirecting it far downstream, away from the densely populated heart of the city. The project required years of continuous excavation through some of the most densely built urban terrain in the world, employing thousands of laborers working with pickaxes, shovels, and horse-drawn carts, decades before mechanized excavation equipment existed to make the job any easier. Bazalgette himself, notably, insisted on building the new sewer network considerably larger in diameter than contemporary population estimates strictly required, reasoning that London's population would continue growing for decades to come, a decision that proved remarkably prescient and allowed his original 19th-century sewer system to continue serving a far larger population than anyone at the time could have confidently predicted. Other cities followed similar, if less dramatically triggered, paths toward organized sanitation over the following decades. Paris undertook a massive renovation of its own sewer and water systems in the mid to late 1800s, part of a broader transformation of the city that also involved widening streets and improving infrastructure in ways explicitly intended to make the city healthier as well as more orderly. American cities, growing at an explosive rate during the same period, faced their own reckonings with accumulated urban filth, and organized municipal trash collection, something that seems so basic and obvious to us today that it barely registers as an invention at all, only began appearing in major American cities toward the very end of the 19th century, decades after some European counterparts had already begun similar reforms. New York City offers a particularly vivid example of just how bad conditions could become in a rapidly growing American metropolis. Throughout much of the 19th century, the city's streets were notorious for accumulated horse manure, produced in staggering quantities by the tens of thousands of horses required to move people and goods around a city with no other form of transportation, alongside household garbage that residents routinely tossed directly into the street for want of any organized alternative. Free-roaming pigs were, for a time, tolerated and even relied upon as an informal, unofficial cleanup crew, since the animals would eat much of the food waste left in the streets, a solution that horrified visitors from more genteel cities but that reflected the genuine absence of any better system. It was not until the 1890s, under a reform-minded street cleaning commissioner named George Waring, that New York implemented anything resembling a modern, organized system of street cleaning and waste collection, complete with uniformed workers who became known, admiringly, as White Wings for their distinctive clean uniforms, a visible symbol of a city finally taking its own filth seriously after generations of simply living within it. The specific individuals who pushed these reforms forward are, for the most part, genuinely forgotten figures today, despite the almost incalculable impact of their work. Public health officials and sanitation reformers in cities across Europe and America spent decades campaigning, often against significant political and financial resistance, to convince municipal governments that organized waste collection was worth the considerable public expense it required. Property owners frequently resisted new sanitation taxes, arguing that centuries of managing without formal collection proved it was unnecessary, an argument that conveniently ignored the mounting toll of preventable disease that these very reformers were trying to address. It often took a visible, undeniable crisis, an epidemic, a notorious stink, a public health statistic too damning to dismiss, to finally push these reforms through against the inertia of centuries of accepted filth. The public health impact, once organized waste collection and modern sanitation infrastructure finally did take hold, was extraordinary, and it happened remarkably quickly once the political will existed to fund it properly. Cities that implemented organized sewer systems and regular waste collection saw measurable, often dramatic declines in cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne or filth-related diseases within just a few decades, sometimes within a matter of years. Public health historians studying the period consider the sanitation reforms of the late 19th century among the single most impactful public health interventions in human history, arguably saving more lives over the following century than most medical breakthroughs of the same era, achieved not through any new drug or surgical technique, but through the comparatively unglamorous work of simply, finally, taking a city's garbage away on a regular, organized basis. And yet, as with so many of these stories, the transformation was never universal, and it was never instant. Organized waste collection reached wealthier neighborhoods first, often decades before it extended into poorer districts of the very same cities, a disparity that mirrored, and in many cases directly caused, corresponding disparities in disease rates between rich and poor neighborhoods that persisted well into the 20th century. Rural areas and poorer nations more broadly often waited considerably longer for equivalent infrastructure, and in many parts of the world today, the basic crisis described throughout this story has genuinely never been fully solved. According to public health and urban development researchers, a substantial portion of the world's population today still lives in areas without reliable, organized waste collection, particularly in rapidly growing cities across parts of Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, where urban populations have expanded faster than municipal infrastructure has been able to keep pace. In these regions, informal waste economies remarkably similar to Victorian London's rag and bone collectors and dust yard workers have re-emerged, out of the same basic necessity, with waste pickers sorting through mountains of urban refuse by hand to extract materials with resale value, performing genuinely essential public health work that is nonetheless often stigmatized, dangerous, and poorly compensated. In conditions that would be entirely recognizable to a 19th-century London dust yard worker transported forward in time by a century and a half. Researchers studying these modern informal waste economies estimate that millions of people worldwide currently earn some or all of their livelihood through waste picking, performing a function that, in wealthier cities, is handled by organized municipal services, and taken so completely for granted that most residents never once consider who is actually responsible for making their garbage disappear each week. In some of these cities, enormous open landfills have grown to a scale that would have been entirely familiar to a Victorian observer of London's dust yards, vast mountains of accumulated waste rising over surrounding neighborhoods, home to entire informal communities of pickers who sort through fresh deliveries of garbage daily in search of anything with resale value, repeating almost exactly a pattern of urban life that wealthier nations quietly solved, and then quietly forgot they had ever needed to solve at all. There is something almost eerie in just how precisely this pattern repeats itself, city after city, century after century, Whenever urban population growth outpaces the unglamorous, expensive, rarely celebrated infrastructure required to actually manage the waste that density inevitably produces. The exact same basic crisis, streets accumulating filth faster than any informal system can clear it, faster than governments are willing to invest in solving, appears again and again across wildly different eras and wildly different parts of the world, separated by centuries and oceans, and yet bound together by the same fundamentally unsolved problem. What happens to everything a city throws away when nobody has built a system to actually take it anywhere? The next time a truck rumbles down your street early in the morning and quietly, efficiently removes an entire week's accumulated household waste without you ever having to think twice about where it goes, consider what that small, unremarkable routine actually represents. It represents the ending of a crisis that cities lived inside of, buried under, quite literally standing on top of, for the entire span of urban history until only the last 150 years or so, a crisis so normalized, so completely accepted as simply the price of living in a city, that it took a government building becoming unbearable to breathe inside of before anyone with real power finally decided enough was enough.